Hello and welcome to this week's topic, which is on the really important area of sustainable supply networks. And we're going to be talking about the triple bottom line as a concept. If you haven't heard of that before, then you're in for a bit of a treat because I think it's such an important and such an interesting area. So what we're going to do, we're going to have an insight into environmental and ethical issues in supply management, but I'll also be introducing key concepts such as green supply, cradle-to-cradle operations, the circular economy, and the triple bottom line. There are some readings that you might want to look into. There's the strategic supply management text that's recommended for this module by Paul Cousins and colleagues, and chapter 14 gives you some material that you might want to read through there. There's a very good paper, and in fact we will be reading this paper in this particular week. The paper by Mickey Howard and colleagues. Mickey Howard's based down at Exeter University, and that's about the regenerative supply chain, a framework for developing circular economy indicators. So I'll be wanting you to read through that, to scan read, and we'll be reflecting upon that exercise, upon that article. And then finally, there's another paper that you might want to look at as well. It's by Schultz and Flanagan, Developing Competitive Advantage Using the Triple Bottom Line. Interesting because that comes up in the Journal of Business and Industrial Marketing. So for those of you who are marketers, it will provide a bit of a link for you. Okay, the topics we're going to be looking at touch on corporate social responsibility, CSR. So if you've heard of that or been involved, we'll be reflecting that. As I've already said, the triple bottom line, often the acronym TBL or 3BL is used there. Green and cradle-to-cradle supply. We'll be considering what are called life cycle assessments of organisations, of their operations and supply chain, and we'll end up thinking about ethical supply. As many of you know, there are many organisations who claim or have the objective of ethical supply in one way or another. Now, a big meeting was held by the nations of the world, and in 2015 they made this big agreement all about carbon reductions, reduction of greenhouse gases by a certain point in time. Now, that was a really important landmark meeting. Unfortunately, many people have paddled back from that, most notably the USA. But it is interesting to have a look at the article in The Economist if you're interested in that area, and to also consider that when we're thinking about the environment and environmental factors, that there are government agreements on this and government commitments to reduce carbon impact and emissions. So for most countries, there are targets in terms of years to be carbon neutral in me, and companies also have made these commitments. So first of all, this is a really strategically important area because of the commitments that people are trying to make. And clearly, we're all interested in making sure the planet doesn't overheat, that whatever we do in the future is sustainable, and that the planet will survive. Okay, there is available a climate report, Hot and Bothered Climate Report, November 2015, which summarises some of the points in that agreement, although, as I say, at the moment, there are nations who are backpedaling away from that a little bit. So, sustainable and ethical supply, it sits within the notion of organisations' corporate social responsibility. So, basically, organisations taking responsibility for their actions and trying to act responsibly, both socially and environmentally. So that's really where our focus is, because supply management and management of the supply chain is really so important in terms of the impact through decisions we make and through our actions in the supply chain and through our supply networks. We can actually impact, and we can reduce our impact on the environment and also in terms of our own ethical behaviour as an organisation. And so we encapsulate this here by the term sustainable supply. Now, if we refer back to some of the challenges for supply management that we had in an earlier session, you may remember this slide popping up under the supply challenge, that one of the big challenges facing us, probably the biggest challenge facing us, is sustainability, social and environmental. And the reality is that challenge is the really big challenge we face nowadays. People talk about COVID-19, but let's hope a vaccine is found for COVID-19. The long-term challenge, the one that is really impacting us, is the impact on the planet and the impact on people and society. Okay, so first of all, why should organisations even bother about sustainable and ethical supply? There are many people who say, oh, it's just the latest trend, it's not really that important. What does it matter? Well, first of all, when we look at what customers are demanding, it's increasingly seen as a value feature. So, for example, people will pay extra to buy organic vegetables. People are concerned about the supply network and the supply chain, and that products and materials and so on are ethically sourced. They will seek to buy those. People are concerned when they purchase vehicles, cars, that they have low emissions, or even switching over to electric vehicles with zero emissions. So increasingly your customers, whether they're your end consumers or whether they're your business customers in business to business, are demanding that sustainability and ethical supply. But also, why bother? Because wider stakeholders are also demanding it. Society, government, targets that are required, and so on. But also, you're doing it because you're trying to reduce risk, particularly reputational risk. So, for example, Nike, over many years, there were quite a lot of challenges. They were selling high-value trainers or sneakers, if you like, in markets around the world, but sourcing them with very low labour costs. So they were costing just a matter of a few dollars to produce, and they were selling them at very high cost. Even Body Shop, which is claimed to be green sourcing, good for the environment, there was a case whereby it was found that 2 or 3 tiers back in the supply chain, admittedly, but there was use of child labour in some of their supply chains, and obviously they had to act quickly to respond to that, but it wasn't great publicity for them. I'm just flicking up this slide here because it sort of shows some examples splashed all over the paper, all over the internet, of companies, perhaps ones that don't have such a good reputation for ethical and sustainable supply. But there again, there are some, like Body Shop, who've been caught out through some of these problems. So we're doing it to reduce risk, as well as it being a value feature for customers and our stakeholders with wider pressure. But also we're seeing that there's increasing social environmental legislation for products and services. So we have to look at the design of the products. We have to think about the processes and the supply chain that they're going through, and thinking about how we're organising labour and where our labour is coming from to meet legal requirements for our products and services. But also you would hope that sustainability should be emerging from the core values and the ethos of the organisation itself. And I'm actually very proud to say that working at Keele, we have a huge commitment to sustainability, not just in terms of an organisation, not just in terms of our research, but practicing what we preach. So you'll notice around the campus that all the vehicles that are being used for moving things around are actually electric vehicles, and you will see demonstrators, collaboration with Siemens on new energy sources and so on. Okay, so those are the reasons why you should be seeking to adopt and develop sustainable supply chains and operations. Now, the first concept we're going to talk about here is the triple bottom line. And if you're new to this, this is something that's really helpful to think about. Okay, so the term was first coined by Elkington in a 1997 book, and was promoted from there. So the idea is that rather than people talking about the bottom line, in other words, thinking everything depends on the profitability or the financial and monetary situation, and remember that many organisations say, what's the impact on the bottom line? Elkington argued that there are actually three bottom lines. The bottom line of not just the economic, the financial, the profitability, but also the social bottom line and also the ecological bottom line. So an easy way of thinking about this is to think about, here we go again, the three P's this time. The triple bottom line, society and people, ecological, in other words, the impact on the planet of our actions, and profitability. And so this concept of the triple bottom line is to say it should not just be all about profitability and profit margins and keeping costs down, but actually we should be taking our decisions with a view to the impact on people, society, ethics, but also in terms of how green our supply chain is, our supply network, and the impact of our operations and supply on the planet. Okay, there's a short video there that's again available on the module web pages, on the KLE pages. We may take some time out just to watch that in the webinar for this week. Okay, so what are we talking about? When we're talking about people, we're talking about fair and beneficial practices. So you've probably heard of fair trade. Some organisations are claiming, and products are claimed to be fair trade, which is that the growers, perhaps in developing countries, get their fair benefit from that, but also free trade, perhaps use of partnerships, using non-governmental organisations to try and help us make the right sort of decisions that are ethically correct, and also, you know, having the right impact on society. That it's really about reducing the exploitation on people, perhaps people less fortunate than ourselves. Planet, so this is all about the natural capital, in other words, protecting our environment and trying to ensure that we're not exploiting the planet. So we're going to have a look in a minute at a concept known as cradle to cradle supply and manufacturing. So this is what's sometimes called the circular economy, and doing life cycle assessments of our own products, our own services, all of our operations and supply, and assessing what the impact is on the planet. And then finally, clearly, organisations should have a view to the financial and economic benefits, profitability as well. So what we're saying is have no regard to profit and the traditional bottom line, but actually a more balanced approach where we balance out the profitability and the economics of the firm against ensuring that we're not seen and we're committed to the non-exploitation of people and the environment. Okay, so the sort of things we see manifested in operations and supply management when we're talking about the triple bottom line are activities and commitments to green supply, where we have people having regenerative designs of their products and services. In other words, they can be recycled, reused, regenerated. Strategies of designing for disassembly, so making it so that we can disassemble, separate out and recycle things, and also so-called reverse logistics, not just thinking about the forward logistics chain, but also how we actually reverse that through for recycling purposes, reuse, remanufacture. Cradle to cradle production supply, which we're going to look at in a minute, but also we see the concept of lean operations coming in. Those of you who know about lean, just in time, and so on, will know that the focus is on this Japanese term of muda. In other words, waste reduction. Don't waste resources. Make the maximum use of those resources. So if we're preaching reducing waste in its broadest sense, it should be all about sustainability, shouldn't it? It should be about best practices whereby we make the most effective use and we waste as little as possible. So often though people claim to be lean, but don't always deploy it in practice. So we have to be careful. And clearly we also have concerns about waste and recycling as well. Okay, so those are the sort of things that we see impacted 20, 30 years ago. Actually very little thought given to some of this. Now right at the mainstream and the heart of what's going on in operations and supply. Okay, so just to put a bit more flesh on the bones of those concepts, traditional linear economies work on this notion of from the cradle to the grave. So we dig things out the ground, we produce them, and then we dump them somewhere. Take, make, and dump, if you like. And it's called the linear economy because it was all one way. Now, what we've seen more recently, a commitment to, rather than cradle to grave, cradle to cradle, C2C production, what's sometimes called the circular economy. And what we're talking about there is obviously in the biological, in the biosphere, seeing this cycle of nutrients, developing plants, organic materials, decompose, but then produce nutrients themselves. So we have this sort of circular action on the left-hand side of the diagram, but clearly we take from the biological, from the biosphere, we take those, develop raw materials, produce organic synthetic materials, manufacture those into products that are used, but then will be actually, rather than just dumped at the end of life, will be disassembled and waste separated to feed back circular mode into the technosphere, into the technical production process, but also products that will be able to decompose, go back into the ground, and the nutrients used again. You see, this is the problem with many plastics, isn't it? That it doesn't decompose, or it only does so very slowly and ends up being dumped or finding its way into the ocean and causing problems. So you can see why this term, the circular economy, has come about. It's about producing and assembling things. It's about looking at the whole life cycle assessment and thinking about how we collect and disassemble items so that we can either feed them back into the technosphere for recycling and reuse, cradle to cradle, or if it does go back into the ground, it's positively going to add over time to the nutrients and be used again. Okay, so cradle to cradle and the circular economy are key concepts here. So any organisation has to do, or should be doing if they're serious about sustainability, life cycle assessments. So analysis of the environmental aspects and the impacts associated with all their products, process, services, supply chain. There are actually international environmental standards out there, ISO 14000. So those standards exist, but there's no universal agreement as to which things you should use in that life cycle assessment. But the sort of things that we're trying to look at are: what's our impact? Are we causing global warming? How can we reduce that? Acid problems, acidification, whether we're sort of depleting the ozone layer, whether we've got toxin release, habitat destruction, either through raw materials or dumping, and so on and so forth. So obviously some of these categories are more relevant for some firms than others, and clearly primary processing industries, mining companies and so on are very keen, oil refining, another one, very keen to try and think about how they can green up their supply, their operations. Hopefully they're committed to it, but certainly if you read their annual company reports, they will often give you examples, try and convince you that they're being socially responsible in what they're doing in their operations and supply chain. The argument is here, of course, that a strong emphasis on the product design phase or service design phase is really important, because all the impacts and the problems are often locked in through poor product design. And some people say as much as 80% of the environmental burden and cost is fixed there. So get your design right of your operations, your products, your services, ensure that they're causing the least impact, because it's a lot more difficult to reduce that environmental impact once you're locked into a product, service and supply chain operation than if you actually designed it in the first place. So this has become a really big feature in terms of creating value for customers. So the things that you might see in a life cycle assessment for a company is to look through the whole life cycle, from the procurement stage, manufacturing, distribution, usage by consumers to end of life stage, and then critically assess at each point how we might be able to reduce our impact on the environment. And so you can pause the video here and read through some of the approaches and some of the commitments that companies make at each stage in the life cycle of their products and services. Okay, now we've said about circular economy, but of course, as well as the logistics chain moving forward from raw materials through to processing, sub-assemblies, and through the whole service operation of buying things through your various tiers of suppliers and distributing your service out to customers and consumers. What happens when we have to take things back? What happens about the recycling, remanufacture and reuse? Well, that's flowing in the opposite direction, isn't it? This is a typical forward logistics chain. And then we've got to think about, okay, reverse logistics is all about reusing things, perhaps remanufacturing and reprocessing items, or the recycling of items back into the technosphere, or whether we can responsibly deposit items which can then decompose back into the biosphere. Okay, there is a video that's available if you want to watch it about disassembly and recycling of BMW as an example. So for example, cars are produced now and are designed not just for assembly, for ease of assembly, but for ease of disassembly, so they can be taken apart and the reverse logistics process start. Okay, so here's an example. Here's the forward logistics chain of for a mobile phone or a smartphone, right the way through the process. No need to talk about that too much. But then let's have a look at what the reverse logistics looks like in green. So we move from the phone usage, and rather than just disposing and throwing away the end phone, let's organise for some form of end-of-life phone collection, and we will inspect and sort these phones that are given back, that people dig out of their drawers in their bedroom and feed back. And we inspect and sort them because we decide whether we're going to refurbish the phone, and if we refurbish it, we might well put it back into demand and use, might even be sent to different countries, or might be resold, reused in some way, or whether we're going to break it down and think about the reuse of some of the components, because things like the lithium batteries, some of the other items that go in can be reused, can be fed back into the component market and go back into components manufacture. But also things like the recycling, can some of it be recycled, go back into the metals market and feed back into primary materials production. Okay, so organisations now should be thinking not just about forward logistics, but also reverse logistics. And increasing legislation is now coming on companies that they have to demonstrate that they will take products back at end of life and manage this whole process. So we can see that as an increasing commitment, particularly in the European Union. We can start to see new guidelines and standards being introduced. Now, we've talked there a lot about the planet, but what about the people side of the triple bottom line. We're really talking here about ethical supply, and we've seen all sorts of issues, particularly associated with outsourcing worldwide. So ethical problems increasing in the supply chain, such as the fire in the contract manufacturers in Bangladesh, with many hundreds of people being killed in that factory, and then finding that they're not just supplying low-cost fast fashion companies, but actually some big brands and top fashion outlets. But also we see things like branded products being recalled. Mattel had a big problem with toy manufacture, with detaching magnets or lead paint being used. They lost control really back in the tiers of their manufacturing when they shifted production to countries like China originally, and they had a lot of very adverse publicity. So we see ethical problems not just being on exploitation of people in the workplace or back in the supply chain, but also when trying to reduce the financial or improve the financial bottom line through lower cost supply and lower cost outsourcing and offshoring production, that actually there are these ethical problems about the impact on the customers as well. Now there's a nice diagram which I'll be providing for you, which was developed by research by Chris Tang, who's at University College Los Angeles, and he develops a structured approach for this. I'm not going to go through it now, but it's in the form of a mind map for ethical supply chain, which you might want to be looking at, almost like a checklist process and a mind map as to how to address particular issues and concerns. Okay, so this is the points on the mind map. The acknowledgement that global production supply the landscape's changing considerably and rapidly. Increasing number of companies move towards outsourcing. The problems were things like labour laws in some countries barely existed and rarely adhered to, and the results, cheap supply, but issues to do with reputational damage to companies and brands, rising number of recalls, therefore perhaps not so healthy for the bottom line, and also the ethical conscience of companies. And you can work through that mind map if you want to follow the outside of it, because it's raising issues about how we might develop an ethical supply chain, tackling the people side of the 3 Ps. Okay, so we're through to the summary now. I've introduced quite a few concepts for you. We've heard a lot about sustainability, environment, but what we're doing, we're looking at it with particular views as to our own operations management and operations design as an organisation, but also in terms of our supply network configuration. And so we've sort of looked at this under the coverage. There's a broad coverage strategic in companies, CSR, corporate social responsibility, but we need to look more specifically beneath that when we're thinking about operations and supply. So I've introduced you to the concept of the triple bottom line. I've introduced you to cradle versus, rather than cradle to grave. Some people talk about the circular economy there. We've considered that organisations should undertake life cycle assessment right the way through their product or service life cycle, what the impacts are. And we've also reflected upon reverse logistics and this issue of ethical supply. So some of the main concerns I've identified there: concerns about the environment, carbon emissions, CO2 emissions, and GHG, which is greenhouse gases, impacts on water quality and pollution there, biodiversity issues, etc., as well as the product use and end of life factors that are there. But also concerns to do with labour, health and safety, working conditions, labour relations, and ethical issues of child and forced labour, exploitation, human rights, and so on. We can also bring in more broadly issues to do with fair business. So, supply chains, sometimes there may be concerns that in some parts of the world it might well operate, if you're not careful, on the basis of bribery and corruption. And also we need to be thinking about fair and responsible marketing of our products and services that we're producing. And then clearly in the supply chain, we need to be thinking about careful selection and development of suppliers, and the impact on the environment, but also thinking about our suppliers in relation to the social and people side. Are we being ethically responsible from societal point of view? Okay, so I hope that that whetted your appetite a little bit, and I look forward to our webinar where we'll be reflecting upon this topic furthermore. Okay, thank you very much, and goodbye.